So I'd like to welcome you all to the Blue Economy CRC's second webinar series for 2022. My name is Lindsay White. I'm from Auckland University of Technology. I'm a member of the Science Executive of the Blue Economy CRC, and I'll be hosting you tonight. While I'm actually in New Zealand, because the CRC is based in Australia, I'd like to firstly begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So as I said, I'm a professor at Auckland University of Technology. My interests are mainly around seaweeds, which sort of play some of a role in what we're going to be talking about today. And I will be hosting the Q&A and introducing our speakers. Just a little housekeeping item before we start is we'd like to, rather than use the chat function in Zoom, we'd like to use the Q&A function. So if you open the Q&A window in your Zoom, in Zoom, you can type in questions, and you can also vote on and upvote on questions that have been asked, which will allow our speakers towards the end to see which questions are the most interesting ones. The Q&A window might go away when people share their screen with you, so you can just sort of unmaximize the screen and you'll still be able to see the Q&A window. So our researchers, investors, product developers, and industry participants are all going to play an important role to scale up ocean carbon project development. That's going to bring new innovation and enable large-scale emissions in reduction, plus many co-benefits such as biodiversity and jobs. And this webinar will highlight how Australia and New Zealand's blue economy participants are well placed to take advantage of their access to the natural capital of our oceans in the immature but emerging global ocean-based carbon markets. This seminar is or this webinar is underpinned by a piece of work that the Blue Economy CRC has commissioned, which was led by Marnie Oaten, one of our speakers tonight. And the report that this is based on is now available on our website, and hopefully you've all found the link to that. If we have too many questions in the Q&A window for us to deal with at the end in the Q&A session, hopefully our guest speakers can type in some of the answers for you, and you'll be able to see those. So today we'll have three presentations. First will be from Sebastian Lertzinger from Auckland University of Technology, one of my colleagues. Then will be Marnie Oaten, who, as I said, is the main author of the report that underpins this. And finally, Alper Bhattacharjee from Hsbc. So I think I will pretty much hand it over. Sebastian, briefly, and I'm hoping that most of you have read the bio online, but Sebastian's a plant ecologist who works at Auckland University of Technology and is interested in the interface of experimental and modeling studies. He has a special interest in the global carbon cycle and questions around carbon sequestration. And he's going to now tell us about the global carbon cycle and some of the difficulties around accounting when it comes to the ocean. So Sebastian, it's over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. So I'm just going to pop up my own slide. Should be only one. Is that visible?
Is it visible?
Yeah.
Not yet.
No. Okay. Let me know it should be. I'm just going to go again.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I just want to give you a very brief introduction, kind of a bird's eye view of the global carbon cycle. And to do that, I have here the global carbon cycle to scale, which is quite a rare thing to see. Most of you have probably seen the global carbon cycle in some form or shape. This is to scale, except the ocean, which is way too big. So we've got the carbon pool in the vegetation here, starting from the left. Can the cursor be seen at all, Lindsay? Yeah. Okay. And okay. Then the pools are in boxes, and the fluxes are depicted with arrows here, but all to scale. So the fluxes are in yearly fluxes, and the pools are just static. So we got the carbon pool in vegetation there, global photosynthesis, plant respiration, soil respiration there, then the carbon in the soil, the atmospheric pool, and then the ocean pool right there. Just gonna get rid of this a little bit. Then you can see the tiny little seaweed pool there, just for comparison, the carbon pool in vegetation. So one thing we can see at the glance here is that the fluxes are relatively large relative to the pools. So that means that if a small change happens in the flux, well, this affects particularly the atmospheric pool pretty quickly and pretty severely. The other thing we can see is that most large fluxes are compensatory. So they have fluxes that go in the other direction and keep the whole thing balanced. Now, the one thing that's obviously out of balance here, or keeping things unbalanced, is our fossil fuel emissions, which are right here. Now, I just want to put some numbers on let me see, here we go. Okay, so here are the numbers. Again, the fluxes are yearly and the pools are just static. And you can also see that, go back to this. Oops, sorry. Ooh, what happened there? Did it just disappear? Okay, this is what I meant to be, sorry. Okay, so you can see that the atmosphere is gaining in carbon here every year. So just a few things I want to point out here using this very simplified description of the carbon cycle. So one is the fluxes are often confounded with pools. So a lot of people talk, for example, about photosynthesis or carbon that is sequestered by seaweed or taken up by seaweed. Well, these are fluxes in the first instance, and unless we know the exact fate of that carbon, this is by no means to be mistaken for carbon sequestration. Yet, both in science and in economic circles, I read it again and again that people talk about fluxes and mean pools in the very same sentence. So if you want to pack away carbon, sequester carbon, we need pools, not just fluxes. And any flux is meaningless unless it is viewed as a net flux. And the ultimate metric here is residence time. So how long can the carbon be locked away from the atmosphere? Okay, well, the other thing we can see here again is the carbon pools are relatively large in the soil and in the vegetation compared to the biological pools in the ocean. So seaweed, they're relatively small with 1 gigaton compared to 650 gigatons in the terrestrial biosphere. Now, if we try not to make the same mistake, a yearly budget. So we've got the 10 gigatons here that are emitted every year by humans. That includes land use change. So it's not quite all fossil fuel emissions. About 9 of this is fossil fuel emissions. It's interesting to see where these 10 gigatons end up. And very roughly speaking, about a third is going into the terrestrial biosphere. A third is going into the ocean, and about a third, a little bit more, is ending up in the atmosphere. Now let's just have a very brief look at what this means and why so much is parked away in the terrestrial biosphere and in the ocean. If it wasn't for this, obviously that extra carbon would end up in the atmosphere as well. So for the terrestrial biosphere, we've got mainly CO2, elevated CO2 in the atmosphere that drives this, a little bit of nitrogen and warming. So it's a lucky thing for us that this happens. We don't know exactly where the carbon ends up, mainly soil and vegetation. In the oceans, you can compare these two major fluxes here, 92 gigatons and 90 gigatons going back. So a little bit is kept in the ocean there, which is not entirely a happy thing, because that leads to ocean acidification, and it's a purely physical process. So this has got very little to do with biology, about 2.6 gigatons per year. And then the rest, the leftover carbon, ends up in the atmosphere. So the challenge really is to distribute these 4 gigatons and try to put some into the ocean, put some into the vegetation, and reduce the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere. Of course, it doesn't really matter if you look at this yearly budget whether we avoid emissions. So if we take it off the 10 gigatons of human emissions, this is the same as if we park carbon, for example, in the ocean. Now, from just looking at this simplified carbons, I'd like to point out some of the differences between terrestrial carbon sequestration and ocean carbon sequestration, and point at opportunities that we've got for ocean carbon sequestration in particular. So on the terrestrial side, starting from the left, it's relatively easy to see that these pools are relatively large, and it is relatively easy to park more carbon in soils and vegetation. Also, the accounting for that is relatively easy, because things can't go, there's not a lot of lateral transport. So if things end up in a forest, they either can be measured as a tree stem or in the soil. Now, this is quite different in the ocean. So the ocean has got quite a sort of different portfolio of options for carbon sequestration. It's certainly not reasonable to think that we can park a lot of carbon in seaweed, even if we double, the amount of seaweed that's basically floating in the sea. Then we go from 1 to 2 gigatons. Well, that's peanuts compared to terrestrial systems. So where the trick there would be to have the fluxes going. So we fix a lot of carbon, but then we need to trace it and either remove it by harvesting that seaweed, or by sinking it into the ocean. The thing is, because there's lateral transport and it's much more open system, this will be much more difficult than in terrestrial systems. And as Mani will tell us, some of these accounting methods are just not as developed yet. Another huge opportunity there in the ocean is just the vastness of the ocean and the lack of competing interests on the surface of the ocean, which is large and obviously quite different on land. The coastline is extremely large, so the possibilities of sequestering carbon where it already exists, mangroves, for example, protecting existing pools, improving them, and there are a lot of co-benefits with that as well. Okay, I think I'm hitting my 10-minute mark. So in a nutshell, again, the opportunities are different from terrestrial carbon sequestration opportunities to ocean sequestration. We need much better accounting tools, which are not all ready to use, and we need to consider fluxes and pools. So are we actually feeding a pool, or is the wheel just turning more quickly? Do we have compensatory fluxes? So if we fix a lot of carbon in seaweed, for example, unless we know exactly where that carbon goes, it is not a way of sequestering carbon. We may just be respiring that carbon very quickly again. Do I have more time?
Yeah, that's great, Sebastian. Thank you very much. I'll probably stop sharing that slide.
All right.
That's cool.
That's my screen.
Thanks. Now, I still can't tell who's being highlighted here. I'm assuming it's me. So thank you very much, Sebastian, for that. And I'm sure there'll be some chat and some questions in the Q&A following. We'll move right on to our next speaker, who's Mani Oten. And Mani's going to firstly present on the key insights from the recently completed Ocean-Based Carbon Markets in Australia and New Zealand report that was commissioned by our CRC. And then she'll talk about a few key barriers that need to be addressed to enable this market to thrive. So Marnie is the Managing Director of OCT Emissions Solutions, which is a technology incubation startup. And Marnie is an entrepreneur and a climate change leader, and will now present on the report. Thanks, Marnie.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Sebastian. Context is everything when we talk about this topic of ocean carbon markets, so appreciate you setting the scene, Sebastian. Look, it was on Friday last week that we launched this 72-page long report on ocean carbon markets in Australia and New Zealand. And if you're anything like me and you get the link and there's an option for the 5-page short form or the long form, you might go and download the short form first. But I wanted to just point out before I leap into some of the analysis and recommendations from that report, I just want to mention what you're missing out on if you go for the short form report and why it's good to go to the long form report. In the longer form report, you've actually got a more detailed summary of the research that's linked to this work and what's currently underway. We've got a bit of a timeline around blue and ocean carbon methodologies and what's in development and coming soon. And there's also a map of where the current project development and research is happening here in Australia and New Zealand at the moment. There's also some definitions, case studies, reports that have come out in the last 6 to 12 months that are really substantial and interesting in this space, and other organisations that are worth following that are very active in this area. So lots of content in our report that's definitely worth scanning. But the conclusion, as Lindsay introduced, is really there's a role for many of you to play in defining ocean carbon markets, and they are immature at the moment, but they are certainly on track to be quite significant in the years to come. So our report is intended for a broad audience, and we hope that it will be quite helpful to navigate near and longer term decision making. I'll move on to the next slide. It was really important to seek input from stakeholders around some definitions on what is an ocean-based carbon market versus an ocean carbon market and blue carbon markets. There's a lot of slightly overlapping definitions out there, so that's also in the report that I'll point you to. And we did interview and survey over 150 subject matter experts in various subcategories as researchers, developers, carbon experts, and the like as part of this report. But what I'm going to switch to now is give a bit of a high-level update on what were the key insights of our report. So when I speak to the next slide, you'll get a bit of a picture of translating what Sebastian was talking about into what are some of the ocean-based and ocean-derived carbon removal and negative emissions technologies that are out there, and the linked, research and project development and investing opportunities. So look, the basis of all this is a little bit what Sebastian introduced, where ocean carbon removal accelerates natural sequestration processes, and there's numerous co-benefits of doing that. And where I'd argue with Sebastian is a gigaton is a lot. That's 10% of what we've, humans are contributing to the atmosphere at the moment. So if we can collectively address whether it's 1 gigaton, 2 gigatons, or 5 gigatons, even though it's not quite the same as the 37,000 gigatons that are encompassed in the ocean, we might have a chance of making some input. But Australia and New Zealand's blue economy participants, and I heard that there was 520 registered of you attending this session today, are really well placed to take advantage of access to natural capital. Some of these technologies and associated projects are already for development, no further work required. And what we're seeing is key is the value of those co-benefits, and Elpa will be talking to what she's been involved with in this space. All these solutions help address the physical impacts of climate change, and reducing barriers to trade in a low emission economy. And there is definitely a competitive spirit amongst nations to play a role in this. And there's the international voluntary carbon markets that are emerging, addressing this space. So this, could be seen as an important opportunity for Australia and New Zealand to become one of the leaders in the international market setting for this. So look, ocean carbon projects are investable now, but there are also key barriers that need addressing to enable the market to thrive. And all of these are it's not impossible to address them with some funding and focus from key stakeholders, and many are on the call today, and form a position that's responding to the opportunity. So if I move on to the next slide, I'm going to sort of talk you through what some of those specific opportunities are. And what we're seeing here is we asked the question to our survey participants, what ocean carbon projects are investable now? And this was one of the unique pieces of analysis that we conducted as part of this research. And you'll see here that the green ticks are what's predominantly investor ready. The yellow is on the way to investor ready, and the red is significant further work required. And what we attempted to do here is to simplify from all the research that's going on in all the various fields and technologies, what sweet spot technologies are more likely to attract investors for nearer term project development. Our team, how we did this, we mapped out the research that was from our own, the feedback that we collected from the people we surveyed and the interviews, and we integrated that with the recent report that was released in December last year around the National Academy Strategy for Ocean-Based, a US piece of work by the US National Academies, which was quite a comprehensive piece of work that sort of overlapped to what we were looking at with the ocean-based carbon dioxide removal projects that was sponsored by Climate Works. So we conclude that research and industry is generally on track to ensure projects with quantifiable co-benefits can be implemented now, and there's some work to do for some in the near future. I'm just doing a bit of a time check. So if we sort of move on to where that leaves us with some of the recommendations and next step of our work, I'll move on to the next slide, Leslie. In the full report, you actually see there's quite a long list of recommendations for broader industry participants, as well as some specific recommendations for the Blue Economy CRC and its industry participants. The more sort of general recommendations are, seemingly obvious, but I think that needs to be said, is that there's a bit of a gap between the land-based carbon markets and what's available in the ocean and blue carbon setting. And so we need to prioritise to make sure that there is a full suite of mechanisms available for ocean carbon projects that will enable investment. And part of addressing the gaps in that is to engage and share information across the various stakeholder groups and to improve the confidence where there is a lot of great work that has been done in research, and there is financial investment criteria and the like that is available now ready to be seized. And what that should lead to is fueling the demand by the investment community with some supply from project developers, and we would love to see more offshore demonstration projects active in the water, applying defensible ocean carbon accounting methodologies and sort of really refining that in the next few years to boost that confidence that's needed. So there's a number of stakeholders need to do that, and my little chart here on the right is a bit of a sort of snapshot of that. So, and where that's going to lead to is some specific recommendations, and the Blue Economy CRC is already supporting some of that work. And the recommendations for the Blue Economy CRC is to expand the role of the Blue Economy zones, which are ocean carbon technologies testbed sites for trialling projects offshore. So we need to sort of boost that program and provide project development initiation support, including accounting and other project insurance activities for project developers. A lot of project developers that are new in this space around carbon projects, carbon removal projects, need a bit more support to get started potentially, and then I have full confidence that they'll be off running with this. And the other sort of opportunities to sponsor research to underpin the robust and defensible ocean carbon accounting methodologies to support more of these offshore demonstration projects. But this is a hot topic. Let's come back, you know, in 6 to 12 months with an update. And I'm really hoping to see more of these opportunities reaching the water. And it's a great space to sort of, for many of us to lean into. And I thank you all so much for contributing to our surveys, reports and feedback along the way. I think I'll hand back to Leslie and to Elpaf to sort of add to the rest of the story. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Marnie. We're going to move on a little bit. There's some interesting questions in the Q&A, and keep those coming. Sebastian's answering a few, and we'll deal with a few more towards the end. Bear in mind that the webinar today is not just about carbon sequestration, but there's all kinds of other strategies for open ocean carbon markets. So there might be some other discussions around this. So Alpa is now going to talk about the investment landscape for ocean and blue carbon project development. Alpa's been with Hsbc for over 10 years and started working in the blue economy space in 2015. And that includes a focus on blue carbon. So I'm going to now hand it over to Alpa. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. Yes, so just to provide a little bit of context, I think from an Hsbc Australia perspective, we have invested quite heavily in research related to understanding blue carbon, sort of how it behaves, what the opportunity is, you know, what the opportunity for investment is, as well as research that's been focused on understanding the economic value of coastal ecosystems more broadly. So looking at it from a sort of climate resilience perspective, primary industries, what it means for tourism and water quality over a period of time. From an Hsbc global perspective, you know, we have recently made commitments to achieve net zero by 2050 within our financed emissions, and we've made commitments to achieve net zero within our own operations by 2030. We understand that, you know, a scaling up of carbon markets will be required to meet net zero, and this needs to be focused on investment in nature-based solutions. And what can we do as an organization to help scale up that investment? So as part of those commitments, we have announced the Hsbc Climate Solutions Partnership, which is a $100 million investment in scaling up the innovations that are required to get to a low carbon economy, within which there is a focus on increasing investments in natural capital and nature-based climate solutions. We have also, of course, partnered with Pollination to create climate asset management, which is a joint venture between our two organizations, which in effect is the world's largest natural capital focused asset manager. Sort of more broadly leading, you know, sort of looking at nature-based climate solutions, in addition to the need to scale up voluntary carbon markets. We're starting to see increased scrutiny and the increased need to factor in nature-related risk, you know, with more than 50% of the world's supply chains reliant on biodiversity or exposed to biodiversity related risk. There need to be the right mechanisms put in place to increase that investment. You know, and sort of talking about carbon markets, and particularly blue carbon, which we know is such a good carbon product, you know, there is increased scrutiny on corporates. You know, I don't think anyone thinks that you can get to net zero without investing in carbon, but I think there is also going to be an increased scrutiny on the quality of those carbon credits. And I think blue carbon can help to answer a lot of those questions. Yes, in terms of the approach to blue financing frameworks, and some of the work that I'm doing with the Nature Conservancy and Earth Security is to create the financing frameworks to invest in coastal ecosystems and mangroves. And I think what comes, to echo some of the findings in the report, there is absolutely a need where we're looking at capital financing mechanisms to understand and properly price in what all of the additional co-benefits are. I think in terms of the work that's going to be required to scale up blue carbon, you need to be factoring in the additional climate resilience outcomes. You need to be factoring in what it means for primary industry. You need to be factoring in what it means for tourism, in addition to the blue carbon. And I think that's where you start to see this really great opportunity for both, sort of mitigation and adaptation. And as we get closer to the COP discussions later this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think it provides a really interesting opportunity, because we're starting to see more of a, demand for a global agreement on adaptation. And we also understand that there is a significant gap in terms of investing in adaptation, particularly in emerging economies. We understand that need for adaptation is going to be between 140 to 300 billion dollars by 2030, but that is also being suggested that has been underestimated quite significantly. So how can you create a case where you're investing in coastal ecosystems, you're realizing the blue carbon outcome, while also really delivering climate resilient development outcomes? I think by taking that kind of approach, you start to create a much clearer picture as to why you would be investing in blue carbon ecosystems, and how you are scaling them up, and how you potentially justify the potential price for blue carbon by appropriately pricing in all of those other co-benefits into financing frameworks. I'll leave it there, and if there are any questions, I can take this later.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alpa. Well, you guys, I tell you what, for a webinar and asking people to stick to time, you guys have done a great job. And we now have plenty of time for discussion, which I suspect might be quite a good thing. We've had a few questions that have been asked and answered in the Q&A. And I suspect that there might be a few more to come. There's a few questions also headed into the chat window. It'd be good if from here on, if you guys could ask your questions in the Q&A window, that would be quite useful. I think you can type them in there anonymously if you would prefer to do that, and where we suspect that anonymous questions might be even more interesting.
Maybe Lindsay, can I just jump in with one, because it was I was under time pressure and it was a bit hectic, and I understand we've got a little bit of time. And just to elaborate on the 1 gigaton there of seaweed. So yeah, the 1 gigaton is considerable, but probably not as a store, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be cultivating seaweed. Of course, it's just the understanding that the initial flux of carbon, so the carbon gets fixed, and that's good, but we need to follow what happens to that carbon. So harvesting seaweed by all means. I mean, these fluxes can be huge, and if you know what's the fate of the carbon, this can absolutely contribute, because as we've seen from the global carbon cycle, there's only about 4 gigatons that end up in the atmosphere every year. So if the ocean can take up 1 gigaton, it's basically done. It's done a fourth of the work. So I just don't want to downplay the opportunities in seaweed. They are huge, but nobody needs to think or should think that we'll be planting seaweed forests that will be, harboring an equivalent amount of carbon than do terrestrial forests. Just an add-on to that, because there was a question as well there, which I answered.
Well, Sebastian, sorry, you've got Lindsay.
Just before you jump in, Marnie, I guess I should say that there's an awful lot of talk around this topic, around the opportunities for carbon sequestration from seaweeds. I would say that that's not necessarily the focus of what we've been trying to accomplish with this particular report, is more looking at potential for other kinds of offsets as well. So, I mean, while it's an interesting conversation around the seaweeds and what seaweeds can or can't do, there's certainly a whole bunch more, that these carbon markets can provide. So, yeah, sorry, over to you, Marnie.
Yeah, Lindsay, I was going to echo the same theme. It's interesting when we went out in our survey and asked our survey participants to rank and describe the opportunity for ocean-derived and ocean-based innovations in this space. You know, we actually had a lot to do with seaweed, but also a lot of else apart from seaweed as well. But I was going to call out the work that Future Feed and other related organisations are doing, which is the seaweed working with methane reductions in the agriculture sector. So that's an example of where seaweed is just part of the value chain for further emissions reductions for the atmosphere. And there's a huge opportunity to sort of join the dots and connect these things in a circular economy type of way, where it's more than one step in the process to get to the impact, I suppose, through the carbon cycles. The other example I was going to give is there's a huge interest in biochar production from biomass, from ocean biomass, and that's also another alternative way to sequester rather than just natural sequestration within the ocean. So there's lots of blended technologies in the solutions. And if I go back to the chart that's we've developed in this report, the ocean-based and ocean-derived carbon removal and negative emissions technologies, I encourage people to look at the whole range of technologies that have potential to be part of collectives that could be contributing to carbon markets, ocean carbon markets. The examples of krill cultivation, artificial downwelling, as well as CO2 removal from seawater are all examples of those other technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Marnie. Alpa, I've got a question for you around coastal co-benefits. So where's the investment community, the blend of productive aquaculture, oysters, mussels, seaweed producers, and conservation aquaculture regarding seaweeds and the volume of offsets in carbon markets? So this is around coastal co-benefits.
Sorry, so from that question, what I'm understanding is how are we factoring in those other benefits and pricing them in? Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, great. So that's a great question. Thank you for that. We have actually done quite a bit of work on physical oyster reef restoration, and we've seen sort of firsthand some of those water quality outcomes in Port Bay and Victoria, which has been exciting to see. I think, sort of what we're trying to do with the Nature Conservancy to demonstrate in a way an answer to this question is we are creating a whole of region framework for investments in this particular coastal ecosystem. So we're taking the mid-north coast of New South Wales and we're taking the findings from previous research and sort of overlaying it across the entire region. And we're looking at it from a revenue stream agnostic perspective to build into a financing framework. So if you were to raise capital for a bond, where are the revenue streams against which you can deliver sort of increased productivity and return? So in that scenario, if you're looking at it from an entire catchment, it's quite possible that there will be oyster reef restoration outcomes. There could be increased opportunities for seaweed or reseeding sort of seagrass meadows, but you can quantify the outcome of all of those different interactions and then any potential sort of additional carbon sequestration over time, and then continue to price that in or potentially invite investors to enter into offtake agreements for that carbon. Sort of that's a perfect world that we see these kinds of mechanisms working. You know, I think in the case of sort of oyster reef restoration, we understand that they are a severely degraded ecosystem in Australia, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done to restore them. But, you know, we also understand that the outcomes of doing that from an aquaculture and a water quality and sort of increased resilience of some of these coastlines is significant as well. So we need to be pricing in the sum of all those different features, and not, not necessarily looking at a project only through the lens of carbon in this particular space. I hope that answers the question satisfactorily.
Okay, so for those of you, thanks, Alpa. For those of you who are monitoring the Q&A window, I'm sort of trying to do that sort of live. There's quite a few questions that are probably outside the scope of these three presenters, but that are important for discussion, particularly within the Blue Economy CRC. And so we will be keeping a record of the questions and attempting to, if your question isn't answered, please feel free to email me afterwards so that we can actually sort of discuss this with you.
Lindsay, I'm happy to attack the question around the First Nations, because it's an area that I've been thinking quite a bit about.
Well, please do.
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, and one of the opportunities with the ocean carbon markets is to look at about access and availability, and I think there's a really interesting connection with Indigenous First Nations people and the ocean, and I think I would love to see, collectives and opportunities brought for First Nations businesses to be running some of these ocean carbon projects as project developers and as groups that have access to the natural capital. So I see this as a great opportunity for distribution of, wealth, but also distribution of ownership in terms of project development opportunity for First Nations and Indigenous participants. And there are a couple of carbon organisations focused on growing opportunities for Indigenous and First Nations people, and it's an area that I think many of us should be leaning into and will work with over the near future. So I'm not sure if that addressed the question, if the person who asked the question, whether there was anything further to discuss. But happy to take it offline. Okay.
There's a question around the status of regulation for sequestration of carbon from seaweeds in either New Zealand or Australia. I'm not sure if anyone wants to attack that one at the moment. I mean, I suspect the answer is that there's no such thing at the moment.
Well,
I was going to point to our report, Lindsay, where in the report, we've actually done a timeline and mapped out in the voluntary carbon markets what methodologies are available now. And there's been some recent developments by Vera in the voluntary carbon markets for methodologies for seaweed cultivation. And so I think we're just starting to see the first of a family of methodologies that are in development, and they're linked to some quite large scale projects that are already underway applying those methodologies. So I think if you have a look at the report, there's a number of examples there, and it's a bit of watch this space. I know in Australia, the focus has been on the blue carbon methodologies that have got up with the Clean Energy Regulator, and the ocean-derived and ocean-based technologies are yet to be seen by that, but we're hoping that will be part of the next generation.
Yeah, thanks, Marnie. There's a question from Richard Bentley around existing projects listed that are actually sequestering carbon, so seagrass projects or whatever. Are there existing projects that are, being accounted for?
Yes, it's Marnie here saying if in our report we've actually gone and hunted them down. The Oceans 2050 group based out of New York City has been tracking the world's largest seaweed projects as part of their work. And on top of that, there's a number of large-scale seagrass, mangroves, and other blue carbon projects that have been that are underway already and are fully financed. So it is worth looking at the report for those examples. A lot of them are in places outside of Australia, such as Madagascar, in Indonesia, and other countries.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's see, what else have we got? Now, okay, let's see what's been... There's a question around, and I'm not sure if our panel's quite up for this one. What technologies do we need to deploy these solutions at scale? So how many of these technologies are deployable today in Australia? And I guess I'll kick New Zealand in there too.
Lindsay, it's Marnie here. I can describe my experience recently. There's the Elon Musk has his X Prize project for carbon removal, and I was part of the team and was amazed to see how many ocean-based solutions were defining the gigaton solution for ocean carbon removal. And so there are actually a long list from, that's linked to what we've described in our report that are being explained how to get to that gigaton level. Personally, I've been seeing a lot of examples around the seaweed cultivation that leads towards the biochar sort of solution, where you've got your permanent durable sequestration in the biochar processes. And that's certainly an opportunity to get to the gigaton scale. But again, those projects, and I think one of them is talking about the millions of ton scales of the example projects that we've got in our report. There's certainly a number of projects underway that are getting closer to the millions of tons CO2 removal. But usually there's a first step in a demonstration pilot project, which might get you to your tens to 50,000 tons CO2 removal. So we are seeing these projects take off. And I know Kelp Blue is a large scale kelp producer and a member of the Blue Economy CRC, and they're certainly looking into the carbon removal benefits of their projects in Namibia, which are very large scale.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a question for me here around the New Zealand equivalent for the Blue Economy CRC. We don't actually have that, Graham. Thanks for asking, and we should talk to our government about that. But there are a number of organisations in New Zealand that are participants in the Blue Economy CRC. So Plant and Food Research, the Cawthron Institute in Nelson, Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand King Salmon are all participants in the Blue Economy CRC. And this CRC is quite unique in that not only are we funding research in Australasia, but also in New Zealand, recognising that participation from New Zealand organisations. So it is truly an Australasian organisation, which is quite unique, and we're very happy about that here in New Zealand. So are there any other
Lindsay?
questions? Sorry, Sebastian, yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in? Because it's just in the chat area, there's someone who does say, and I really want to clarify this, it's really important. The person is saying, I must be missing something, but the first slides seem to show that the opportunity for seaweed is very small. This is not what I said. So what I said is we need to be very mindful what happens to the carbon that is potentially fixed. So just to give you an example, it's basically, you're sitting in a bathtub, and if you have a massive tap and I don't know 200 liters of water coming in per minute, but at the same time you've got a massive drain, so this would be the equivalent of growing a heap of seaweed, but that seaweed just disperses in the ocean and gets respired very quickly again. I'm not saying that is necessarily the case, but without us knowing exactly what the fate of this carbon is, the fluxes can be as large as anything, as you've seen from the first slide, that the fluxes can be huge. If they're compensated by an equal flux that goes in the opposite direction, which may well be the case, it's the case for plankton largely. There's a lot of productivity, but there's a lot of respiration at the same time. So I'm not saying there's no opportunity there. There's a huge opportunity, but we need to harvest the seaweed or make sure that we can trace it. And that paper that was circulated in the chat area, a few people have sent it around, that's just come out, is really good at pointing out that things are just a little bit more complicated, because you need to account for, you know, if a fish bites off a piece of seaweed, well, then it's likely, you know, unless the fish sinks to the bottom of the ocean, that piece of seaweed will be respired and the carbon goes straight back into the atmosphere. But even then, residence time is the key. So if you lock away the carbon for 20 years from the atmosphere, there's still a job that's done. So the opportunity is huge, and I think Lindsay can maybe speak to that much better than me. The opportunities are there, but we must be very clear about whether we're talking about fluxes or actual pools, and whether we can trace and track that carbon that's being fixed in the first place.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm not trying to keep the focus off of seaweed for this webinar, given that I really like seaweed and everything, but it is important. And the paper that's just come out in the Journal of Ecology, which looks at the potential for actual decent accounting of potential for seaweeds as a carbon sequestration device or species. It's really important for anyone who's interested in carbon sequestration from seaweeds. It's very important that you actually get hold of that paper and read it. And, you know, one of, not the only take-home message from that paper, but one of the very important ones is that as Sebastian has pointed out, carbon sequestration in the ocean is a vastly more complex situation than it is in terrestrial settings. You know, you grow a tree and turn it into a house. You've sucked that down from the atmosphere. It's not exactly the same thing in the ocean, for a number of reasons that the paper that's recently been published points out. So, for those of you who are interested in that, and the seaweed side of things, and I know there's a lot of you out there who are interested in other things, it's very important that you do read that paper, or contact one of us to talk about it if you'd like to. Let's see, we've got a few minutes left.
I'm going to answer that one about the investment products to monetize blue carbon.
Oh, please.
Sure, because I think that does talk to some of the investment hurdles as well. So yes, we are. So in Australia, we are working, as I sort of alluded to earlier, on sort of frameworks for bonds focused on mangroves and sort of coastal ecosystems more broadly, within which there will be blue carbon considerations. We will also be, you know, sort of over the coming couple of years, be looking to address, and that's not just in Australia, this will be globally as well, at some of the barriers to scaling up investments in blue carbon, and trying to understand what the incentives and mechanisms that are required, particularly to aggregate small projects, and how we need to be engaging with landowners and communities and ensure that any loss of initial livelihood is properly compensated. So there definitely are, you know, there definitely is work being done to monetize blue carbon and natural capital more broadly. I guess in terms of hurdles is, you know, there is definitely a gap between, there is definitely a gap between methodology and market a little bit. So, you know, with some of the work that we're doing to build out investment frameworks for mangroves, for example, you know, it's going back and understanding what all of that data is, understanding all of the environmental economic accounting, you know, sort of speaking to the relevant stakeholders and asset owners who would potentially be investing in any debt issuance around these particular ecosystems. And it's a similar situation with blue carbon in Australia. It's that yes, the first methodology has been approved for blue carbon credits, but there is still a gap between how we get from method to an actual market. And that's what we're working on. How do we bridge that gap to be able to actually scale up market and accelerate to market. And that's sort of the role that we're looking to play globally in terms of accelerating investments in natural capital and new carbon market.
Okay, thank you very much, Alpa. Let's see, we've got about 5 minutes left. Do any of the presenters have targeted any questions that they'd like to tackle before we finish?
I could tackle Claire Murphy's question around the standardised approach for quantifying co-benefits and blue carbon.
Okay.
I think this was a key theme that came out of the feedback from our survey participants, and it's sort of interesting whether or not it's a, you know, state, federal government, is this going to be overtaken by voluntary carbon markets in the international landscape? You know, so I think the answer to who is going to be responsible for moving towards standardized methodologies, I think that's the sort of big question, and Elpa hinted at investment groups are doing it themselves because there is a gap there in the actual market available. So this is where natural capital accounting and other types of accounting programs are being established to quantify co-benefits that make it, you know, provide the needed requirements from an investment perspective. So I would love one of the takeaways from this discussion to move towards a working group. And I was going to mention I am part of a low emissions technology working group with DFAT, with the Australian government, and they've recognised with their standards committee the need to maybe do some further work in this space. And that was as recently as last week that came up. So I think we're in the early stages of the emerging market, and I think if you're patient, you know, there will be some activities over the coming years that will make participation easier for more people.
Thank you, Marnie. So Alpa or Sebastian, are there any other questions that you'd like to handle before we wrap this up?
I'm just interested in that last comment by Phil. The panelists and chairs are still mixing and matching terms, seaweed cultivation, blue carbon. I was wondering what is meant there. For me, the key is really to keep fluxes and pools apart. Again, that's this whole confusion about fluxes and pools is so old. It's as old as science, I think. But the question is the residence time of carbon. So how long can you pack it away from the atmosphere and store it either in the ocean or in the soil or in plants? It doesn't even matter. How long is it? If you pack it away for 100 years, that's better than 20 years. But if it's respired within a week, then you haven't really done anything to the system. And yet you can have massive photosynthesis and carbon fluxes. So photosynthesis and then respiration again. So it's the wheels turning, but it's turning fast and there's nothing locked away. So you've got a bathtub with a massive influx and a massive outflux. So it doesn't get any fuller.
Okay, Alpa, do you have any last comments before we wrap this up?
No, I think I've covered all of the questions aimed at me. Thank you.
Lindsay, Sunny Sanderson asked the questions around the next steps, you know, where to from here, which is probably a nice way to finish up from my side. There will be the good news is the Blue Economy CRCs are already addressing a number of the recommendations that have come out of this piece of work through their quite extensive research program coming up. And there are further opportunities for people like myself to work with other members of this community who joined the webinar to propose some specific further actions as well. And maybe I welcome those people to reach out to me personally, and maybe we can work on addressing some of those next steps together. So thanks, you know, it'll be good to reach out.
Okay, well, we've got about 2 minutes, so I'm going to sort of draw this to a close. I'd really like to thank our three presenters today, Sebastian, Marnie and Alpa. Thank you very much for putting yourselves out there and answering all the interesting questions. I think given the amount of traffic, both in the chat and the Q&A, and also the amount of people who have decided to attend this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Obviously, this is an issue that people are very interested in. Again, I think I would encourage those who are interested in the idea of carbon sequestration in particular around the ocean to read the paper that I think has been put into the chat window, and those can find it on forensic carbon accounting. So particularly around seaweeds, but obviously there's a lot more to be said about open ocean markets than just seaweeds. And the CRC is addressing a lot of these, as Marnie has said, across a range of activities, not just, it's not all about seaweeds as much as I'd like to think it is. So again, thank you very much for all attending. This recording will be available in the coming days. And of course, Marnie's report is already available in a short and a long form, read the long form obviously, on our website. So thank you very much for all attending, and we'll see you at the next CRC webinar.